Thank you so much, Christina, and a massive thank you to you and Yvette for organizing today's symposium, and to the National Gallery for hosting us in this beautiful space. And I also want to thank all of you in the audience for coming this morning and learn a little bit more about Ukraine and Ukrainian art, past and present. If I could go back to my title page, thank you. So as Christina mentioned, I am currently a Ph.D. candidate at the Courtauld Institute of Art in Ukraine, or in London, and I'm working on, Ukrainian avant-garde art. So I'm looking at the socio-political aspects and how they influence the development of art in Ukraine in the early 20th century. So today I will talk about the school of monumental art that was created in Ukraine at the start of the 20th century by the artist Mikhailo Boychuk, this man. As indicated by the title of my paper, I will trace the development of the school style from the so-called Neo-Byzantinism of the late 1910s to the appearance of the first elements of Socialist Realism in their later work, in the work that they created sort of a decade later. I aim to discern Boychuk's artistic methods and objectives while situating the activity of his school within the rapidly changing social-political landscape of the early 20th century. And that was the period that saw Ukraine actually gain and lose independence, with its territory eventually being split between the Soviet Union and Poland. But first, I want to briefly outline sort of the historical background of Ukraine before the revolutionary year of 1917. So this is Ukraine as we know it today, or rather as we knew it when the country gained independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, and before Russia annexed Crimea and parts of Donbass in 2014. At the time of Boychuk's birth, in late 19th century, however, Ukrainian lands were divided between two empires, Russian and the Austro-Hungarian. So this is how the map looked back then. And I need you to do a little bit of intellectual gymnastics here to overlay the previous map with this one. But essentially, if I can, so the outline of Ukraine goes like this. So we can see that the majority of its territory was under the Russian Empire, but the western part, western part called Galicia was under Austro-Hungary. And I just to avoid confusion, want to point out that the name of the capital there, of Galicia, Lemberg, that's German name for what we today call Lviv, or what was called Lviv back then by Ukrainians. And Ukraine lost its statehood in the middle of the 18th century when Catherine II of Russia abolished the Ukrainian Cossack state. So back to Boychuk. He was a native of Galicia. He was born in a small village not far from Lviv, and he came to the city at the age of 16. Back then, Lviv was sort of the center of the national Ukrainian movement. And the reason why it was, you can say that it was more important than Kiev back then, was because the authorities in Vienna, unlike their counterparts in Russia, they were much more lenient towards Ukrainians. So they allowed them to publish in their own language and also to create and establish their own cultural and political organizations. So as a young man, Boychuk was close to a circle of patriotic Ukrainophiles in Lviv, and they provided financial assistance for him to complete his studies in Europe. So he went and studied at the academies of Vienna, Krakow, Munich, and Paris. And during these formative years, Boychuk observed various influences, but chief among them were the Byzantine art, the examples of which he studied both in Ukraine and in Italy, pre-Renaissance Italian masters such as Giotto, and the symbolism of the Nabi group, and he studied with the members of the Nabi group in Paris. All of these encounters led Boychuk to develop his own version of the Neo-Byzantine style, or the way he called it was Rénovation de l'art byzantin, and that was in 1909 and 1910 when he started exhibiting in Paris. For reasons that will become clear towards the end of my talk, not many of Boychuk's works have survived. A rare example is this icon-like painting from his early period that shows a synthesis of all the styles that I've just described. So we can see flattened forms characteristic of Byzantine art, a harmonious composition learned from the Italian pre-Renaissance painters, and then Nabi inspired decorativism and symbolism. While studying in Paris, Baychuk was exposed to the commercialization of art, which he opposed and tried to counteract. For that reason, he assembled a group of fellow students from Eastern Europe who worked together in the spirit of medieval workshops in which artists were encouraged to forego their individuality in favor of collective work. And it was also around this time that Baychuk started to advocate for Ukrainian art as a national treasure and not a mere commodity. And this stance was the result of his background, so his peasant origins, but also his interaction with Ukrainophiles. And it kind of allowed him to build a sense of identity that was based on respect for tradition, his nation, and the countryside. Following the February and October revolutions in Petrograd in 1917, with the ensuing unrest in Russia, the pro-independence political activists in Ukraine seized the opportunity to establish their own state, the Ukrainian National Republic, with Kiev as its capital. Originally, it was an autonomous state, so it was in federative union with Russia. But after the Bolshevik coup in October, the leaders of the Ukrainian National Republic proclaimed independence of Ukraine from Russia. And the Ukrainian National Republic sort of propagated a mixture of liberal nationalism and socialism that initially appealed to the broad masses in Ukraine. They were also quite keen to establish national cultural institutions, and so they sponsored the opening of the Ukrainian Academy of Arts, the first ever higher art school on the territory of what today is Ukraine. And among the founders of the, one of the founders of the academy was Mikhailo Baychuk, who was by then 35. And he established, at the academy, he established the fresco mosaics and tempera studio, where he taught his students the principles of monumental art that he envisioned as belonging to the people. Since the academy's records have not survived, it is unclear how many people exactly enrolled into Baychuk's studio during his intake in late 1917. But the core group that continues to study through the Civil War and graduated in 1922 consisted of approximately 10 students. One of them was Baychuk's younger brother, Timofey. And I'm showing here a painting by Timofey from 1919 as an example of this sort of Neo-Byzantine style that Baychuk passed on to his students. Here too we can see the flattening of figures and colors, a somewhat primitive rendering of the landscape, but this time a new element appeared, a national theme suggested through the distinctly Ukrainian clothing of the female apple pickers. Again, I will pause here briefly just to provide a little bit of a historical background of what was happening in Ukraine while Baychuk was teaching his first cohort at the academy. So between 1918 and 1921, the territory of Ukraine became literally a battlefield of various competing forces, and Kiev changed hands 13 times within that space between several Ukrainian governments, the White Russian Army, the Bolsheviks, and regiments of the newly re-established Polish state. Ukraine officially lost its independence in March 1921 when a new Polish-Soviet border was established. And so this is how Europe looked after that. And we can see that eastern and central Ukraine and southern Ukraine with Kiev and Kharkiv ended up under the Soviet Union, whereas the western part with Lviv came under Poland. And so, as central and eastern Ukraine integrated into the Soviet Union, Baychuk's studio emerged as one of the leading artistic groups who completed numerous state commissions for public spaces and buildings. And henceforth, Baychuk's students will be referred to as Boychukists. They embraced Lenin's plan for monumental propaganda, which employed visual arts at the service of transmitting revolutionary and communist ideas, creating posters, such as this one that was done by Baychuk himself, painting agitational trains and boats, as well as producing street decorations for various anniversary celebrations. Unlike their counterparts in Moscow and Petrograd, however, Boychukis did not apply the principles of what we today call avant-garde art. So they didn't apply the principles of cubism or futurism in their propaganda work. Rather, their imagery was rooted in local art and folk traditions. And to illustrate this last point, I want to look at the first large-scale Bolshevik commission completed by Boychuk's workshop, the decoration of the Lutsk military barracks in Kiev in the spring and summer of 1919. Earlier that year, the Red Army captured the city, forcing the government of the Ukrainian National Republic to retreat westwards. And so the barracks, which were built in the late 19th century, were to be used for stationing the Red Army soldiers. But many of those soldiers were actually recruited from the local peasantry that was lured by the Bolsheviks' promise of land and peace. For the commission at the Lutsk barracks, Boychuk assembled a group that was comprised of his brother Timothy, Ivan Padalka, Oksana Pavlenka, Vasily Sedlyar, and there was also another artist working with them, Anna Tsemlova, but there is virtually no information about her, so I couldn't find an image. So this group created 14 large compositions, and in line with Boychuk's preferred method of collective work, most of the paintings were executed jointly, using adhesive paints that were applied directly to the walls. And this image that you see on the left, just to point out, because the quality is not particularly good, the man on the ladder is actually, and the art is painting the walls, it's not part of the scene. So the paintings themselves were destroyed when the barracks were undergoing repairing works a couple of years later. But black and white reproductions, such as this one that you see on the screen, have survived in the publications of that time. And from the extant images, it can be discerned that one of the main themes of this cycle of paintings was a fraternization between the city and the village. Such motif is visible in this painting, Strength and Unity, which depicted a simple meal shared by what appears to be a worker on the left, so your left, this guy, a Ukrainian in the middle, and a Russian peasant on the right. The proletarian standing of the figure on the left can be discerned from his more urban attire and the fact that he was seated on a chair, whereas the two other figures were placed on a lava, which is a bench that was a typical feature of peasant homes. The Ukrainian nationality of the central figure was suggested by his distinct moustache and an oseledets, a traditional Ukrainian male haircut, usually associated with the Cossacks, that features a long lock left on otherwise completely shaved head. Meanwhile, the identity of the figure on the right as that of a Russian peasant could be recognized from his beard and a bowl haircut, but also his sporting of lapti, the bust footwear that was common for Russian peasantry. The Ukrainian theme was further reinforced in another painting, Let Yourself Loose or So, which captured a seated figure of Kazakh Mamai, so this guy here, playing a bandura, a traditional Ukrainian string instrument. Mamai was one of the most popular characters in Ukrainian folklore, and he was often depicted in local art. And I'm just going to show you a couple of examples. So this painting by an unknown artist from the 18th century, and it presents quite a sort of typical iconography used for depicting Mamai. And here is another slightly later example from the 19th century. So Mamai was a symbolic figure representing the 17th century social and national liberation struggle led by the Cossacks in Ukraine against Poland, which at the time controlled the majority of Ukrainian lands. In the painting at the Lutsk barracks, Mamai was approached by another Cossack who could be seen curling his moustache, a gesture that was commonly read as a sign of gallantry and boldness. So this lent the scene a somewhat humorous or even frivolous mood that was further emphasized by the inscription "Гуляй душа без кунтуша." And this is a Ukrainian proverb that can be very loosely translated as "let yourself loose or so." So the word kuntush in this inscription, it was traditional outerwear of the nobility in Ukraine, very often specifically associated with Polish nobility, the szlachta. So the saying kind of suggested liberation from the upper classes, but at the same time it reinforced the painting's overall reference to the Cossack times, but also their fight against Poland. And such an allusion would have been poignant in 1919 for Ukrainian soldiers in the Red Army who were fighting the troops of the newly re-established Poland as one of their main adversaries in Ukraine. So both these paintings, Strength and Unity and Let Yourself Loose or So, they were set within this kind of arched niche decorated with a floral garland. This ornamental element suggested a reference to the Byzantine tradition that was common for local churches in Ukraine. The religious connotation was even more explicit in another painting. Workers and peasants, united in the proletarian revolution, destroyed the hydra of capitalism. And again, the image that I'm showing is actually a working moment of creating the painting, but it has already been sketched out quite well so we can understand what's kind of being depicted. So here, the figure of the Red Army soldier on horseback, and he can be recognized as such by his budyonovka, a hat that was the key element of the communist military uniform during the Russian Civil War. Piercing the hydra with a spear was modeled on the iconography of St. George slaying a dragon. And the latter was quite a popular subject in Ukrainian icons, especially during the aforementioned national liberation struggle led by the Cossacks against Poland. And again, I'm going to show you a couple of examples. So this icon from Volyn, which is today in Western Ukraine, from the late 17th century, and here is another example, a slightly later one. Sadly, the figure of the dragon, which was supposed to be here, has disappeared, but you can kind of see the reference. In the interest of time, I will show a couple more images from the Lutz barracks without describing them in as much detail. So there is another collective work, and we can see again this like ornamental garland running at the top. And as I said, like most of the paintings were executed collectively, but there were also some that were created individually by members of the group. So this one was done by Timofey Boychuk, Mikhailo's younger brother, and here is another example by Ivan Padalka. We can see that the cycle works marked a departure in the practice of Boychuk's school, while still retaining such elements of the Byzantine tradition as simple composition, primitive rendering of figures, and the use of ornament to create an overall stylistic coherence. The employed iconography was based on and emphasized local folklore. This, so to say, vernacular imagery would have been readily accessible to the soldiers stationed at the barracks. And again, I'm stressing that many of them came from the local villages. So with this commission, Boychuk and his students were making the first step in mastering the revolutionary content on a monumental scale, while developing a new visual language that would have been legible to the aesthetic consciousness of their audience, an audience that was predominantly Ukrainian. And so here the question arises of why such vocally pro-Ukrainian artists as Boychuk would remain in the Soviet Union and collaborate with the Bolsheviks. I believe that this question is important not only for a more comprehensive understanding of Boychuk and his school's oeuvre, but also for the study of the new cultural and political identity that emerged in Ukraine in the 1920s. During its first decade in power, the Soviet regime introduced the policy of Korenizatsiya, or indigenization. In essence, it was a strategy aimed at appeasing local nationalisms by granting constituent republics 4 forms of statehood or nationhood: territory, language, elite, and culture. The policy was known in Ukraine as Ukrainizatsiya or Ukrainization, and it allowed local intellectuals to create a self-standing culture that was both Soviet and Ukrainian. Even if temporary and completely reversed by Stalin in the 1930s, Ukrainizatsiya stimulated the overcoming of Ukraine's cultural provincialism that was inflicted by centuries of imperial rule. In the case of Boychuk and his school, this meant a synthesis of the traditional and the innovative for the constructive reconstitution of Ukrainian art, which they saw as part of international heritage. While the authorities in Moscow accorded Ukrainian national projects some form of statehood and supported the development of Ukrainian culture, Boychuks could be celebrated as the most important group in the contemporary art of Ukraine, and they were celebrated as such. The Russian art critic Yakov Tugendhol, for example, explicitly praised the school's focus on their own heritage rather than on Moscow and Paris. And so Boychukis continued to work with the simplified graphic forms and monumental scale throughout the 1920s, but their visual language evolved, gradually becoming more plot-driven and three-dimensional, and hence inevitably realistic. It can be suggested that in such a way they were embracing kind of some elements of socialist realism, which would be formulated as the official artistic style of the Soviet Union in 1932. The shift was partly due to the socio-political outlook of the younger generation within Boychuk school that matured in the Soviet Union and was therefore prone to support the concept of proletarian hegemony in art. On the other hand, there was also increased scrutiny from the critics and the officials who increasingly looked for class content and class properties in art. Despite this, Boychukists still managed to retain sort of some elements of characteristically national Ukrainian coloring in their work. And I want to show this painting by Ivan Padalka from 1927 as an example. So while it portrays a typical proletarian scene, meaning a scene from the everyday life of common people, it is a life of peasants and not workers that it was concerned with. Being quite realistic in a representational sense, the painting nonetheless betrayed decorative elements of the Boychukist style through the simplified ornamental rendering of the background and a somewhat statue-like positioning of the figures of the villagers. By capturing a specific moment, Padalka nevertheless presented a synthesized, universal image of life in a Soviet village, or more precisely, Soviet Ukrainian village. And I'm concluding. Even though Boychuk School continued to receive state commissions and played a central role in the cultural life of Soviet Ukraine, various allegations against Boychuk and his students started to appear in the late 1920s. Initially, the critics were chiefly concerned with the creative mistakes of their formal language, which they characterized as, and I quote, depleted formalism that replaced life observation and active attitude to reality with that schematism and rigidity of the art of the past, end of quote. With time, however, Boychukists were increasingly accused of peasant psychology or peasant limitations and petty bourgeois psychology that hindered the development of proletarian internationalism in the form of socialist realism. Mikhailo Boychuk was arrested in November 1936 as the leader of a fictional nationalist terrorist organization. So were his closest associates, Ivan Padalka and Vasil Sedlyar. All three were executed the following summer. Boychuk's wife and fellow artist from his school, Sofia Nalepinska Boychuk, was also arrested and executed 5 months after her husband. The majority of the art produced by Boychukists, including all of their Pablo murals, was systematically destroyed as that of the enemies of the state. The execution of the key members of Boychuk school in the late 1930s, as well as many other Ukrainian intellectuals, marked the end of Ukraine's cultural self-determination that was once an integral part of the Soviet project. From then onwards, the only ideal left for Soviet artists to pursue openly and officially was that of single realist tradition, in which proletarian internationalism increasingly came to mean the all-Russian cultural chauvinism. Thank you.